Okay, get started.
Okay. Greetings. We're now getting to the end of the search for a nonviolent future, making this set of videos available for you to help you perhaps use it in your classrooms or other venues. And Chapter 8 is kind of paired off with Chapter 7, addressing the biggest scale question of violence, namely a war, interstate war or intrastate war. How can you apply nonviolence there when people tend to think of nonviolence as a group struggle within a society, the overthrowing of an oppressor, or so forth? And we now, having talked about the roots of war lying in the human mind, which is the audacious focus of Chapter 7, we're now going to look at some institutions that have been created since Gandhi to actually implement nonviolent power to overcome the war system by making national defense and various other aspects of security doable through nonviolent means as opposed to doable only through violent means as we thought. So we now come to an institution that in fact has engaged my energies for many, many years. It's an outgrowth of what Mahatma Gandhi called the Shanti Sena, or the Peace Army, and it became a worldwide movement known for a while as Third Party Nonviolent Intervention, TIPNI, TPNI, and then that acronym has shifted over to Unarmed Civilian Peacekeeping. That's what it's called today. And this chapter will focus on how teams of volunteers, at best internationals, will get themselves ready and be on call to go and intervene in a highly conflicted area. And these courageous people, most of them young people, many of them strictly volunteer, though there's a worldwide organization that I'm closely affiliated with called Nonviolent Peace Force, which pays their field workers subsistence level wage like as we do Peace Corps volunteers. These people will go and make themselves available for various offices, good offices, in some of the most highly contested places in the world, including Sri Lanka, Mindanao, Northern Sudan, Guatemala, Colombia, and indeed some domestic deployments in the United States, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where the Ku Klux Klan likes to have a rally every year, and with Native American versus what they call First Nation versus Canadian conflicts in our northern neighbors in Canada. So these are highly courageous people. They will go in, they will perform whatever needs to be performed, rumor abatement, rescuing of child soldiers, which is done very successfully in Sri Lanka, being an intermediary, and if necessary, is the in extremis, being ready to interpose yourself between two conflicting armies, even in a hot conflict, even if bullets are flying. So we are building this up into a worldwide institution which has a tremendous power. I think, I've always believed that if we have this in place and get people to really recognize and understand it, and incidentally, that's a problem within the peace movement known as interpretation, where you not only do something and it works, but you then have to explain to the public why it worked, which is what Search for a Nonviolent Future is all about. So I'm getting carried away here. Back to the chapter. We start off touching on this concept of the Peace Army and quickly move to discuss one of the most dramatic, spectacular individuals in the history of peace worldwide, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, otherwise known as Bacha Khan, who is finally getting due recognition in his own Pakhtun area in Afghanistan. At the moment, as I'm speaking to you, by coincidence, I happen to have three very good friends in Kabul who didn't know one another. So we pulled them together and enabled them to carry out a very important project in Bamiyan, so forth, and Meta will be involved with supplying some materials for them. But Khan Saab was, you just have to read his story. He's just a marvelous giant of a man, very compassionate, incredibly courageous, spent about a third of his life in prison, first under the British and then in Pakistan. But he created an army of nonviolent volunteers. So there are 4 myths about nonviolence which the career of Abdul Ghaffar Khan dispels. These myths are just busted by him once you know about him. The first is that nonviolence can only be used against a gentle, civilized opponent because it's a weak force. The British in the Northwest Frontier Province, as was then called, his part of India, were neither gentle nor civilized. They regarded the Pathans as leopards. In other words, they totally dehumanized them in their own mind, and they treated them as such. Then the second myth: in order to be nonviolent, you have to be a nice guy or a nice gal. Or Gandhi said, you have to have guts. You have to have courage. You actually have to be capable of violence to be made into a nonviolent warrior. Now, nobody was more capable of violence than your Pathans, and they were often more nonviolent, more enduringly than the Hindus down in the plains, who had nonviolence in their ideology for millennia. So it's wrong that you need a Mr. Nice Guy as your opponent. It's wrong that you have to be a softie or some kind of wuss, as we call them nowadays, to carry it out. It is wrong that nonviolence could not be used in a military context, because after all is said and done, the Khudai Khidmatgars, the organization that Khan pulled together, consisted of over 80,000 people. They were uniformed, they were obeying discipline, they were obeying their commander-in-chief, Abdul Ghaffar Khan. They were an army in every sense, except that did not use weapons. They were not an army that was designed to employ and implement negative energy, destructive energy. They were an army, if you will, to mobilize and deploy constructive energy. And finally, perhaps today, since the writing of Search for a Nonviolent Future, this has become even more important. It proves that nonviolence has a home in Islam, because the Pathans, the Muslims, were deeply religious Muslims, and that they could adopt nonviolence on strictly Islamic principles proves forever that you can do nonviolence in an Islamic context. Resonates perfectly with the core of that great religion, as it does with the core of any great religion. In fact, we have just come back from a talk that we were privileged to give in a mosque in Michigan, which is the headquarters of a continent-wide Islamic organization, and it is dedicated to nonviolence. And they are very glad to hear from us, and we will be working with them. Now, this civilian-based, unarmed civilian peacekeeping is, as it were, one wing of how you can institutionalize nonviolence and use it in a military context. The other wing is an idea that's been around a little bit longer. It's called civilian-based defense, and it was well studied by the early wave of nonviolent scholars around Gene Sharp, who worked on what we call today strategic nonviolence. And this is where, instead of getting a team of people together to go to a different place and do a cross-border intervention, where part of the magic of your appearance there is that you're a third party, this dispenses with third-party involvement and instead mobilizes the citizenry to defend itself either against external attacks, which is the main reason that wars are called into existence. Hey, we have to defend our country, so while we're at it, we'll attack yours. Or it can be used to destabilize a putsch, a coup d'etat. And there are several examples in history of this being used very successfully, even though people did not know exactly what they were doing. They had studied neither Gene Sharp nor Michael Nagler, and they were just going off the cuff. And I focus on one case, which is kind of the classic for civilian-based defense, which is the Prague Spring Uprising of 1968, 1969, which eventually, after 8 months of successfully holding 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops at bay, with hardly any killing, hardly any violence, any damage to property or what have you, done in a truly nonviolent spirit, which the Czechs seem to have a natural gift for. After holding out for 8 months, they were unfortunately betrayed by their leadership. So there is really no evidence that the nonviolence itself was too weak to carry on and defeat the communist attempt to reimpose control on the country. And it does raise an interesting question in the heuristics of nonviolence. How are you going to learn about it? What are you going to look at? You could look at Prague Spring and say, hey, but it failed. You know, in the end, the Russians came in with their Polish and Hungarian and other allies, and they did reestablish a communist regime. But it was rather modified, much milder than what had been in place originally. And more to the point, as I say, in the book, the Russian High Command projected that it would take 4 days to crush any kind of Czech resistance. This thing went on for 8 months. So it gives you an index to the tremendous power of nonviolent resistance. If you know what to look for, you see that positive fact, you see the success, and you build on it. And that's how you learn what nonviolence can do for us. Okay, and then I focus on the underlying fact that I've been stressing of late in these talks with you, that you can really reduce this bewildering complexity that we call life to a duality, a simple choice. Are we going to put our energy, our will, our intelligence, whatever we've got, on the side of nonviolence or on the side of violence? Is it going to be dedicated to constructive energy or destructive energy? There are lots of ways, and each individual case will have to work out how to do this, but really it's just a simple underlying choice. And I point out in the chapter many instances of people who, by participating in an institution that is designed to mobilize destructive energy, they become much worse as human beings, whether that institution be a prison or a military institution. Okay, since then, in the last few years, we have begun to realize what an appalling cost on our men and women who are fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, on the psychological level, what it does to them, how they have to be degraded as human beings in order to participate in such a thing, and how when they come back, that degradation, that human loss, hurts them so deeply that they never recover. And we're now reaching a level of suicides among soldiers in combat and after returning, which is gone consistently higher in every conflict since Vietnam. If you contact us at the Meta Center, by the way, metacenter.org, we have an op-ed on this that can give you some of the particulars. So similarly, just as, and oh, incidentally, there are now 2 other things I might mention that have come up since the writing of the book. I have a friend and colleague, Rachel McNair, who has developed a concept in psychology called Perpetration Induced Traumatic Stress, PITS. This focuses scientific attention on the fact that when you hurt another human being, you are hurting yourself. And since since 1988, and I did not know a word about this when I wrote the original version of Search, we have discovered the mirror neuron system in the brain that actually are the neuronal carriers of this empathic response to another human being's joy or suffering. So the TPNI, and the other thing I wanted to mention is there was a very good study done at Stanford called the Stanford Prison Experiment, where they just took Stanford students and they put them in, I'm passing over the opportunity to make some kind of a quip as a Berkeley man, but I'll just say they took these Stanford students, put them in role plays as either prisoners or guards, and they're perfectly blind, could be anyone